Long before there was a Russia, before the Tsars and Soviets, before St. Petersburg and Moscow were names that carried weight across the globe, the lands of Eastern Europe and Northern Eurasia were the domain of forests, rivers, and endless grasslands. This immense space, stretching from the Carpathians to the Urals, from the Baltic Sea to the Caspian, was not yet a country, nor even a state. It was a frontier of scattered tribes, shifting migrations, and rising and falling nomadic empires. It was in this environment, in this vast expanse of land, that the roots of what would one day become Russia were planted. The story begins with geography. Russia's defining feature is its size, the largest country on Earth today, covering more than 17 million square kilometers. But in antiquity, these distances were not measured by maps, but by the length of rivers, by how far a horse could ride in a day, by how much snow would fall in winter. The land was both a blessing and a curse. Its endless steppe, the great Eurasian grassland stretching from Hungary in the west to Manchuria in the east, created a natural highway for nomadic peoples. For thousands of years, mounted tribes swept across it. First the Scythians, then the Sarmatians, later the Huns, Avars, Khazars, Pecheneg, Cumans, and eventually the Mongols. Each came in waves, displacing or assimilating those who came before. Russia's history would be profoundly shaped by this steppe corridor, which was a constant threat, but also a bridge to trade and contact with the wider world. The earliest peoples known in these lands appear in ancient records from Greek and Roman sources. By the 8th century BCE, Herodotus described the Scythians, fierce horsemen who roamed the Black Sea steppe. They were not a single tribe, but a confederation of nomads, archers who could ride and shoot with deadly precision. Archaeology confirms their presence. The burial mounds known as kurgans dotting Ukraine and southern Russia contain weapons, jewelry, and even sacrificed horses, testifying to their warrior culture. By the 3rd century BCE, the Scythians were supplanted by the Sarmatians, another Iranian-speaking people whose dominance lasted until about the 4th century CE. Both Scythians and Sarmatians left their imprint on the cultural and genetic makeup of the region. In parallel, Slavic tribes began to emerge. Their origins are debated, but most scholars locate the earliest Slavs in the areas around present-day Poland, Belarus, and western Ukraine by the 1st century CE. They were primarily agricultural communities, practicing slash-and-burn farming in the forests and building small villages along rivers. They spread slowly but persistently, often moving eastward and southward. By the 6th century CE, Byzantine chroniclers were describing the Slavs as raiders and settlers pressing into the Balkans. By the 7th and 8th centuries, Slavic groups had spread across much of Eastern Europe, reaching the forest zones of present-day Russia. These tribes, the Polans, Drevlians, Severians, Viadics, and others, lived in loose, kin-based communities without strong central authority. Yet these Slavs did not exist in isolation. They mingled with and absorbed elements from their neighbors, the Balts to the northwest, the Finno-Ugric peoples of the Volga forests, and the Turkic tribes who rode the steppes. The Khazars, a Turkic polity that rose in the 7th century, established a powerful empire along the lower Volga and Caspian. They controlled key trade routes that connected the Islamic Caliphate to northern Europe, and their rulers famously converted to Judaism around the 8th or 9th century. Slavic tribes in the forests often paid tribute to the Khazars, who acted as middlemen in the lucrative trade of furs, slaves, and honey. This was the earliest economic order into which Proto-Russian societies were drawn. Trade was crucial. From the north came the Varangians, Norse traders and warriors, often called Vikings. Sailing down the great rivers, the Dnieper, the Volga, the Fokhov, they linked the Baltic to the Black Sea, and from there to Byzantium. The route, from the Varangians to the Greeks, became a commercial lifeline. Along it, Slavic villages grew into fortified towns. Archaeological evidence at sites like Novgorod shows the blending of Norse, Slavic, and Finno-Ugric artifacts, runic inscriptions, Byzantine coins, and San-Lavic pottery. The seeds of urbanization were being planted. This interplay of nomadic power, settled farming communities, and riverine trade networks set the stage for the first political structures to arise in the region. But in this early period, up until the 8th and 9th centuries CE, the landscape remained fragmented. There was no Russia, no central authority, only tribes negotiating survival in a land without natural borders. Harsh winters shaped their agricultural cycles, forcing them to rely heavily on hunting, fishing, and the gathering of forest products. Wooden idols of Purin, the thunder god, or Mokosh, the earth goddess, suggest the persistence of pagan religion, while occasional contact with Christianity filtered north from Byzantium long before conversion became official. The cultural tapestry was further complicated by waves of external pressure. In the 4th and 5th centuries, the arrival of the Huns destabilized the region, pushing Slavic and Germanic tribes into the path of the collapsing Roman Empire. Later, the Avars and Bulgars imposed their power, followed by the Khazars. Each of these empires left behind traces in the organization, weapons, and alliances of the Slavic tribes. By the 8th century, the Pecheneg and Magyars, steppe nomads, raided deep into Slavic territories. The precariousness of life under constant threat would ingrain a deep sense of vulnerability into the psyche of the Eastern Slavs. It was also a land of remarkable resources. The dense forests provided furs prized in European and Islamic markets. The rivers carried amber, wax, and honey southward, and slaves, taken in raids, were traded to the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate. The very word slave in many European languages comes from Slav, reflecting the scale of this commerce. For outsiders, these lands were less a mystery than a source of wealth. As centuries passed, Proto-Slavic settlements became more complex. Defensive wooden walls, or gorodishes, appeared. Craft production developed: iron smelting, pottery, and weaving. Local chieftains, knyaz in later terminology, began to consolidate authority, though often precariously. What emerged was not a centralized state, but a loose cultural and economic zone, a frontier where Norse adventurers, Slavic farmers, Turkic nomads, and Byzantine traders all intersected. By the 9th century CE, the stage was set for the birth of something new, a federation that would unite these scattered tribes, control the river trade, and negotiate with the great powers of its day. The lands before Russia, this frontier of forest and steppe, had been a crucible. Its geography of open plains and endless rivers, its cycles of invasion and migration, its mosaic of cultures and peoples had created the conditions out of which Kievan Rus would emerge. But before the glittering domes of Kyiv could rise, centuries of struggle had already defined the nature of this region: vast, vulnerable, and destined for power. Under the cold northern skies of the 9th century, the scattered tribes of Slavs, Finns, and Balts lived in small fortified settlements, linked by rivers that flowed southward to the Black Sea. These rivers were highways of commerce, piracy, and conquest, binding together lands as far apart as the Baltic and Byzantium. It was along these waters that the first true Russian state would be born. The chronicles recall a pivotal moment in 862 when the Varangians, Norse adventurers and warriors, were invited to bring order to the land. According to the primary chronicle, the Slavic and Finnic tribes grew weary of internal quarrels and the extortion of foreign raiders. They sent a message north across the sea: "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and rule over us." From this tale emerges the figure of Rurik, a Varangian chieftain who established himself in Novgorod, a fortified settlement along the Fokhov River. While historians debate the literal truth of this account, there is no question that Varangians, traders and warriors of Scandinavian origin, were deeply embedded in the politics and economy of Eastern Europe during this era. Rurik's death around 879 left power in the hands of his kinsman, Oleg, who would prove a shrewd and ruthless leader. In 882, Oleg set his sights on the more strategically located city of Kyiv, a hub on the Dnieper River controlling access to the steppe and the Black Sea. Seizing the city through cunning, Oleg declared it the mother of Russian cities. This act effectively laid the foundations of what would be known as the Kievan Rus, a loose but powerful confederation of Slavic and Finnic tribes under Varangian leadership. Oleg's campaigns extended Rus influence southward, raiding Constantinople in 907. The treaty he negotiated with the Byzantines in 911 granted the Rus favorable trading rights and established a precedent for the close, if often violent, ties between the Slavic north and the Byzantine south. This early state was less a centralized kingdom than a federation of principalities bound by tribute and allegiance to a ruling dynasty. Its lifeblood, the succession after Oleg passed to Igor, Rurik's son, who ruled from 912 to 945. Igor's reign illustrated both the opportunities and perils of ruling such a realm. Like his predecessor, he launched campaigns against Byzantium, but the Byzantines, now wary of Rus power, inflicted a stinging defeat in 941 by setting his fleet aflame with Greek fire, a secret weapon that terrified enemies on the sea. Igor regrouped and secured a more favorable treaty in 944. Yet his rule ended violently. When he attempted to extract excessive tribute from the Drevlians, one of the Slavic tribes, they rebelled and killed him in 945 by tying him to bent trees and tearing him apart, a brutal reminder of the fragility of princely authority. Into this chaos stepped Igor's widow, Princess Olga of Kyiv. Though she initially assumed the regency for her young son Sviatoslav, Olga proved a formidable ruler in her own right. She exacted ruthless vengeance on the Drevlians, burying their envoys alive and burning their city with fire carried by pigeons, according to the Chronicle's vivid, if semi-legendary, account. Yet Olga's reign was not only remembered for cruelty. She centralized tribute collection by establishing administrative districts, an innovation that strengthened princely power. Most significantly, she became the first Rus ruler to convert to Christianity, journeying to Constantinople around 957 and being baptized by Emperor Constantine VII. Though her people resisted her faith, Olga's conversion foreshadowed the decisive shift that would come in the next century. When she died in 969, she was remembered as a saint in the Orthodox tradition, a bridge between pagan Rus and Christian Byzantium. Her son Sviatoslav, who came of age in the 960s, was a warrior of relentless energy. Rejecting his mother's Christianity, he remained a pagan and carved out an empire on horseback. Leading campaigns deep into the Volga against the Tsars, he shattered their power around 965, ending centuries of tribute paid by the Slavic tribes. He turned his attention to the Balkans, launching raids that brought him into direct conflict with Byzantium. In the 970s, he campaigned as far as Bulgaria, threatening the empire itself before being forced into retreat by Emperor John I Tzimiskes. On his return north in 972, he was ambushed by the Pecheneg at the Dnieper Rapids and killed, his skull reportedly made into a drinking cup by the steppe nomads. Sviatoslav embodied the warrior ethos of the early Rus, pagan, expansionist, and deeply entangled with both the steppe and Byzantium. The succession now fell to Sviatoslav's sons, igniting fratricidal conflict. The most enduring figure to emerge was Vladimir, later called Vladimir the Great. Initially ruling Novgorod, he seized Kyiv in 980 after defeating his brothers. Like his predecessors, Vladimir was a pagan, and the primary chronicle describes him erecting idols to the gods Purin, Kors, and Mokosh. Yet Vladimir was pragmatic as well as devout, and around 987 he began to consider a new religious settlement. According to the chronicle's vivid but stylized narrative, he sent envoys to examine the faiths of neighboring peoples: Islam among the Volga Bulgars, Latin Christianity among the Germans, Judaism among the Khazars, and Orthodoxy among the Byzantines. The envoys returned most impressed by the splendor of Constantinople's Hagia Sophia, declaring, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth." The tale may be more legend than fact, but in 988, Vladimir was baptized, and he ordered the mass conversion of his subjects in Kyiv. The city's residents were brought to the Dnieper River to be baptized en masse, symbolizing the official Christianization of Rus. This decision was transformative. It aligned Rus with the Byzantine world, introducing Slavic peoples to Orthodox Christianity, Byzantine art, and architecture, and the Cyrillic alphabet developed earlier by the missionaries Cyril and Methodius. It also provided a unifying ideology for the diverse federation, binding its people under a shared faith. Vladimir cemented his alliance with Byzantium by marrying Anna, the sister of Emperor Basil II, a marriage that signaled Rus' recognition as a major power. The Christianization of Rus in 988 stands as one of the most decisive turning points in Russian history, shaping its spiritual and cultural identity for centuries to come. Vladimir's reign also strengthened the political and military foundations of the state. He fortified Kyiv, minted coins bearing both Christian and pagan symbols during the transitional period, and expanded Rus' authority westward into Galicia and Volhynia. When he died in 1015, his legacy was contested by his sons, sparking another bloody succession crisis. The conflict culminated in the rule of Yaroslav, remembered as Yaroslav the Wise, who consolidated Rus' power and presided over its cultural flowering. But that is a story for the next chapter. This formative century between Rurik's legendary arrival in 862 and Vladimir's baptism in 988 established the essential character of the First Russian state. Born of Norse adventurers and Slavic tribes, hardened by war with Byzantium and the steppe, it was in this period that Rus ceased to be a collection of tribes and became a kingdom with a shared religion, a ruling dynasty, and a place in the wider world. The rivers that had long carried merchants and raiders now carried priests, scribes, and ideas, and the Rus people began to conceive of themselves not merely as subjects of princes, but as part of a Christian civilization that reached across Europe and the Near East. The echoes of this transformation would shape all the centuries that followed. The early 11th century brought Kievan Rus into a new phase of stability and cultural flowering, as the reign of Yaroslav the Wise, 1019 to 1054, secured dynastic authority and gave shape to the institutions that would define Rus society. After the death of Vladimir the Great in 1015, fratricidal struggles erupted among his numerous sons, a recurring pattern in Rus politics. Yaroslav initially ruled Novgorod, but when his brother Svyatopolk seized Kyiv and ordered the murder of other brothers, Yaroslav raised an army of Novgorodians and Varangian mercenaries. In a series of battles between 1016 and 1019, he emerged victorious, forcing Svyatopolk into exile and consolidating his position as Grand Prince of Kyiv. His reign became a model of princely authority, remembered for both military campaigns and legal, cultural, and religious achievements. Yaroslav's foreign policy demonstrated the power of Kyiv at its height. He fought against the Pecheneg, steppe nomads who had long threatened Rus. In 1036, he inflicted a decisive defeat on them outside Kyiv, ending their ability to raid Rus territory. To commemorate the victory, he ordered the construction of the Grand St. Sophia Cathedral, whose domes still stand as a testament to Byzantium's architectural influence on Rus. Yaroslav also turned westward, forging dynastic marriages that integrated his realm into European politics. His daughters married into the royal houses of France, Hungary, and Norway, while his sons were installed in various principalities across Rus. This earned him the nickname Father-in-law of Europe. These alliances underscored how Kievan Rus, once a frontier federation, had by the mid-11th century become a recognized power in Christendom. Internally, Yaroslav is credited with the codification of Rus law. The Rus Justice, Ruskaya Pravda, compiled under his reign, was the first written legal code in Eastern Europe. Unlike the brutal punishments of contemporary Germanic law codes, it emphasized fines and compensation over corporal punishment. This reflected both the agrarian structure of society and the Christianizing influence of Byzantine law. The code regulated property rights, inheritance, and penalties for violence, helping to standardize justice across the realm. Yaroslav also patronized the translation of religious and legal texts from Greek into Church Slavonic, strengthening literacy and ecclesiastical culture. The establishment of monasteries, such as the Kyiv Petrsk Lavra in 1051, created centers of learning and manuscript production, embedding Orthodox Christianity deeply into Rus identity. Yaroslav's reign, however, could not resolve the structural weakness of Kievan Rus' dynastic system of succession. Unlike primogeniture in the West, Rus followed a system of lateral succession. Rule passed not from father to eldest son, but from elder to younger brother, and then to the eldest of the next generation. This system, designed to keep the dynasty united, instead generated constant disputes. After Yaroslav died in 1054, his sons attempted to preserve unity by agreeing to a division of territories with Kyiv as the senior seat. Izyaslav ruled in Kyiv, Sviatoslav in Chernihiv, and Vsevolod in Pereyaslav. But rivalries quickly emerged, exacerbated by the ambitions of younger princes and the pressures of nomadic incursions. The 11th and 12th centuries were marked by fragmentation and shifting alliances among Rus principalities. The once dominant role of Kyiv weakened as regional centers like Novgorod, Vladimir Suzdal, and Galicia grew in strength. Novgorod, in particular, developed a distinctive form of republican government. There, a vesh, or assembly of free men, held power to invite or expel princes, creating a unique experiment in participatory politics compared to the autocratic tendencies elsewhere. Its prosperity was based on trade with the Hanseatic League and control of the route to the Baltic. In the northeast, the Principality of Vladimir Suzdal expanded under the rule of Yuri Dolgoruki, who founded Moscow in 1147 as a minor outpost. The 12th century also witnessed increased threats from steppe nomads. After the decline of the Pecheneg, the Cumans, also known as Polovtsi, dominated the steppe. They conducted devastating raids into Rus lands, forcing princes into alliances and counter-campaigns. The Lay of Igor's Campaign, a great epic poem composed around 1187, captured the tragic encounter of Prince Igor Sviatoslavich against the Cumans, symbolizing both the heroism and disunity of Rus princes. The constant need to unite against steppe enemies was undermined by their incessant quarrels with each other, leaving the land vulnerable to greater dangers that loomed to the east. Despite political fragmentation, Kievan Rus remained culturally vibrant. Byzantine influence permeated art, architecture, and religious life. Icon painting flourished, with works such as the Vladimir Mother of God becoming central to Rus devotion. The church played a stabilizing role, and metropolises in Kyiv often mediated disputes among princes. Monastic chronicles preserved the memory of events, blending historical narrative with religious interpretation. The primary chronicle, compiled around 1113 by the monk Nestor, became the foundational text of Rus history, shaping the way later generations understood their origins. It portrayed the princes alternately as defenders of the Christian people and as sinners whose quarrels invited divine punishment. By the early 12th century, the balance of power within Rus shifted definitively away from Kyiv. The city, though still symbolically central, lost control over its hinterland. Galicia and Volhynia in the southwest emerged as powerful principalities, closely tied to Poland and Hungary. In the northeast, Vladimir Suzdal became the nucleus of a new political order, with fertile lands, dense forests, and rivers that connected it to both the Volga trade and the steppe. Its princes, especially Andrei Bogolyubsky, 1157 to 1174, sought independence from Kyiv, even seizing and sacking the city in 1169. This shocking act demonstrated the decline of Kyiv's preeminence and the rise of regional powers. Meanwhile, Novgorod maintained its unique republican institutions and immense wealth, trading fur, wax, and fish northward. The weakening of Kyiv coincided with mounting external pressures. In 1203, the Polovtsi, allied with discontented Rus princes, sacked Kyiv, leaving it devastated. The fragmentation of Rus into dozens of competing principalities by the early 13th century left it ill-prepared for the most formidable invasion in its history. To the east, the Mongol Empire, forged by Genghis Khan in the early 1200s, had begun expanding westward after subduing much of Central Asia. In 1223, Rus princes joined forces with the Cumans to confront a Mongol detachment at the Battle of the Khalkha River. Their defeat was catastrophic. The Mongols crushed the coalition, capturing and suffocating princes beneath a victory feast. Though the Mongols withdrew after this raid, the event revealed the vulnerability of the fractured Rus lands. The cultural and political fragmentation of Kievan Rus in this period must be understood not as a collapse, but as a transformation. Regional identities took root. Novgorodians saw themselves as a mercantile people tied to the Baltic. The princes of Vladimir Suzdal envisioned a strong autocratic order in the northeast. Galicians fostered ties to Catholic Europe. The Orthodox Church remained a unifying element, with its liturgy in Old Church Slavonic and its allegiance to Constantinople, but its ability to impose political unity was limited. When the Mongols returned in 1237 under Bata Khan, grandson of Genghis, the disunity of the Rus would seal their fate. Yet before this calamity, the legacy of Kievan Rus, its Christian faith, its legal codes, its chronicles, and its urban culture had laid the deep foundations for the Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian identities that would later emerge. The centuries of Kievan Rus left a paradoxical inheritance. It was a realm born of Varangian initiative, baptized by Byzantine faith, and shattered by internal rivalries. It had expanded along the arteries of the Dnieper and Volga, prospered from trade, and built monuments like St. Sophia that endure to this day. Yet its inability to establish a stable system of succession or a centralized state left it vulnerable. The seeds of Russian autocracy and Orthodox spirituality were planted here, even as the centrifugal pull of its principalities tore it apart. The stage was now set for the Mongol storm that would transform the destiny of Rus and reshape its civilization for centuries. By the mid-15th century, the land that had once been known as Kievan Rus was no longer a coherent realm. Kyiv had long declined, devastated by Mongol incursions, eclipsed by the rise of new centers further north and east. For nearly 2 centuries, the fragmented Rus principalities lived under the dominance of the Golden Horde, compelled to pay tribute and acknowledge the Khan's overlordship. Yet from this long period of subjugation, a new power emerged, centered not on Kyiv, but on Moscow. The city, first mentioned in the chronicles in 1147 as a minor outpost of the Principality of Vladimir Suzdal, rose slowly during the Mongol era. Its princes demonstrated shrewdness in navigating the politics of the horde, collecting tribute on its behalf, and consolidating power over neighboring lands. By the late 15th century, Moscow had transformed into the nucleus of a new state. ready to challenge both the Mongols and rival Rus princes for supremacy. The decisive figure in this transformation was Ivan III, later known as Ivan the Great, who ruled from 1462 to 1505. Under his leadership, Moscow expanded dramatically, incorporating rival territories and asserting independence from the Mongols. His reign marked the shift from fragmented principalities to a centralized autocratic state. Ivan's marriage to Sophia Paleologina, the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, in 1472, gave Moscow both symbolic and ideological capital. With Constantinople fallen to the Ottomans in 1453, Moscow could now claim to be the heir to Byzantium. Russian churchmen and courtiers began to speak of Moscow as the Third Rome, the final bastion of true Christianity after Rome and Constantinople. This idea, though still embryonic in Ivan's time, would profoundly shape Russian political theology in the centuries to come. Ivan's struggle with the Golden Horde culminated in 1480 in the standoff at the Ugra River. For decades, Moscow had paid tribute to the Khans, though its power steadily increased. When Khan Ahmed of the Great Horde attempted to reassert dominance, Ivan led his forces to the Ugra. The confrontation ended without battle, the Khan withdrew, and Moscow ceased tribute payments. This moment, celebrated in Russian tradition as the end of the Tatar yoke, symbolized the emergence of Moscow as a sovereign power. In practice, the horde had already been weakened by internal divisions and the rise of successor khanates such as Kazan, Astrakhan, and Crimea. Yet the psychological significance of 1480 was immense. Russia no longer bowed to foreign masters. Ivan III also strengthened the institutions of the state. He created a centralized bureaucracy, codified law in the Sudebnik of 1497, and curtailed the independence of boyars, noble landowners. The Sudebnik established a uniform legal system, introduced measures to bind peasants to the land, and marked an early step toward the development of serfdom. Moscow's rulers also introduced symbols of sovereignty drawn from Byzantium, including the double-headed eagle as the state emblem. The Kremlin was rebuilt in stone with the help of Italian architects, creating the fortified heart of Muscovite power that endures today. The consolidation of Moscow under Ivan's rule prepared the ground for a new stage in Russian history, the transformation of a principality into an empire under Ivan IV, remembered as Ivan the Terrible. Born in 1530, he inherited the throne in 1533 as a child, with his mother, Elena Glinskaya, serving as regent until she died in 1538. His early years were marked by neglect and violence from rival boyar clans, experiences that left him deeply suspicious and prone to cruelty. In 1547, at the age of 16, Ivan was formally crowned as Tsar of all Rus, adopting a title derived from Caesar and claiming an imperial authority that set him apart from his predecessors. The coronation was accompanied by elaborate religious ritual, sanctifying his rule as divinely ordained. The early years of Ivan's reign saw significant reform, led in part by a council of advisors known as the Chosen Council. Between 1549 and 1560, measures were introduced to modernize governance and strengthen central authority. The Sudebnik was revised in 1550, curtailing corruption among officials. The army was reorganized, introducing the Streltsy, a corps of musketeers equipped with firearms. And a new representative assembly, the Zemsky Sobor, was convened in 1549, bringing together nobles, clergy, and townsmen to advise the Tsar. The church was also reformed under Metropolitan Macarius, who canonized numerous Russian saints and codified ecclesiastical law. Ivan's ambitions extended beyond reform. He sought to expand Moscow's dominion into the remnants of the Mongol Khanates. In 1552, he launched a campaign against the Khanate of Kazan on the Volga. After a bloody siege, the city fell, and Kazan was incorporated into Russia, bringing the Volga Basin and its Tatar population under Muscovite control. In 1556, Astrakhan followed, giving Russia access to the Caspian Sea. These victories marked a turning point. For the first time, Moscow was no longer merely resisting steppe powers but conquering them. The conquest of Kazan was celebrated with the construction of St. Basil's Cathedral on Red Square, its multicolored domes commemorating the triumph of orthodoxy over Islam. Ivan also turned his gaze westward, seeking access to the Baltic Sea through the Livonian War, 1558 to 1583. Initially successful, Russian forces captured much of Livonia, but the conflict eventually turned disastrous. A coalition of Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, and Denmark forced Russia into retreat, and by 1582, Ivan was compelled to accept a humiliating truce that left him without Baltic access. The war drained resources, devastated Western territories, and embittered Ivan against his own nobility, whom he blamed for military failures. In the 1560s, Ivan's reign took a darker turn with the creation of the Oprichnina, a separate domain under his personal control administered by loyal guardsmen dressed in black and mounted on horses adorned with dogs' heads and brooms, symbols of sniffing out treason and sweeping away enemies. The Oprichniki unleashed terror on the boyar elite, confiscating lands, executing nobles, and spreading fear across the realm. In 1570, Ivan ordered the brutal sack of Novgorod, suspecting its leaders of plotting treason. Thousands were massacred in a campaign of devastation that crippled one of Russia's oldest cities. The Oprichnina ended formally in 1572, but it left a legacy of arbitrary violence and centralized despotism that scarred Russian society. Ivan's later years were marked by paranoia and personal tragedy. In 1581, in a fit of rage, he struck his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, with his staff, killing him. This act left the succession in the hands of his weak second son, Fifer, who lacked the capacity to rule effectively. When Ivan died in 1584, Russia entered a period of instability, with the throne passing to Fifer and the real power exercised by his brother-in-law, Boris Godunov. The dynasty of Ivan the Terrible, the Rurikids, would soon collapse, ushering in the time of troubles. The rise of Moscow and the reign of Ivan the Terrible marked a decisive chapter in Russian history. The principality had thrown off the Mongol yoke, claimed imperial authority, and expanded its territory across the Volga and into Siberia, where Cossacks under Yermak Timofeyevich launched expeditions in the 1580s that opened the vast east to Russian colonization. Yet this growth was shadowed by the deepening of autocracy, the terror of the Oprichnina, and the exhaustion of prolonged wars. Moscow had become the heart of a centralized state, but one built on the fragile foundations of coercion and fear. The legacy of this era would endure for centuries. The conception of Russia as heir to Byzantium, the expansion into multi-ethnic frontiers, and the establishment of a tsardom that wielded both spiritual and temporal power without restraint. When Ivan IV, remembered as Ivan the Terrible, died in 1584, he left behind a transformed but destabilized realm. The title of Tsar, the expansion into Kazan, Astrakhan, and Siberia, and the consolidation of Moscow's power had elevated Russia from a collection of principalities into a centralized state. Yet Ivan's terror and violence had crippled the nobility, depopulated vast regions, and left the dynasty without a strong heir. His son Fifer I, who succeeded him, was frail, pious, and politically ineffective. Real power fell into the hands of his brother-in-law, Boris Godunov. Kiev reigned until 1598, and with his death, the direct Rurikid dynasty, which had ruled since the time of Rurik in the 9th century, came to an end. This dynastic extinction opened a crisis that would plunge Russia into the time of troubles, a period of famine, civil war, foreign invasion, and impostors vying for the throne. Boris Godunov had already wielded authority during Kiev's reign, and his position was strengthened by Kiev's childlessness. In 1598, he was formally elected Tsar by a national assembly, the Zemsky Sobor. Godunov's rule initially appeared promising. He continued the policies of centralization, supported colonization in Siberia, and sought to modernize the state. He also promoted relations with Western Europe, inviting foreign experts to aid in technical development. But his authority was always fragile, as he lacked the sacred legitimacy of the Rurikid bloodline. Many boyars, the great noble families, resented his rise, and his regime rested on a delicate balance of force and persuasion. The most catastrophic event of his reign was the famine of 1601 to 1603, caused by a series of poor harvests likely linked to climatic anomalies of the Little Ice Age. Torrential rains and early frosts destroyed crops, and widespread starvation followed. Contemporary accounts describe whole villages deserted, corpses littering the roads, and desperate peasants reduced to cannibalism. Estimates suggest that as many as 2 million people, nearly a third of the population, perished in these years. The famine undermined Godunov's authority, and rumors spread that his sins had provoked divine punishment. Peasant uprisings erupted across the countryside, joined by impoverished townsmen and bandits. One major rebellion was led by Klopko Kosolap, a former military man, whose followers ravaged central Russia before being suppressed. Amid this crisis, a pretender appeared, claiming to be Dmitry Ivanovich, the youngest son of Ivan the Terrible, who had supposedly died in Uglich in 1591 under mysterious circumstances. Many believe the boy had been murdered on Godunov's orders, though the truth remains uncertain. This pretender, known as the false Dmitry, surfaced in Poland-Lithuania around 1603, where he won the backing of Polish magnates and some Jesuit missionaries. He promised to convert Russia to Catholicism and grant privileges to his supporters in exchange for aid. With a small army of Polish nobles, Cossacks, and mercenaries, he invaded Russia in 1604. Godunov's forces initially resisted, but the Tsar's sudden death in April 1605 left the throne vulnerable. His son, Kiev II, was murdered in Moscow, and the false Dmitry entered the capital in triumph. For a brief moment, Russia had a Tsar whose legitimacy rested entirely on pretense. In May 1606, the false Dmitry was crowned in the Kremlin. He married a Polish noblewoman, Marina Nisik, and filled his court with foreign advisors. But suspicion and resentment grew. His Polish connections and hints of Catholic sympathies provoked outrage among clergy and boyars alike. In May 1606, barely a year after his coronation, he was overthrown in a coup led by Prince Vasily Shuaysky. The pretender was killed, his body desecrated, and Shuaysky proclaimed himself Tsar. Yet the fall of the first false Dmitry did not bring stability. Instead, a cycle of impostors and foreign interventions began. Soon, another pretender arose, styled Dmitry II, claiming to be the true Dmitry who had escaped the coup. He established himself with Polish backing at Tyshino, near Moscow, creating a rival court that drew disaffected nobles and Cossacks. This Tyshino thief, as he was derisively called, controlled much of the countryside while Shuaysky clung to Moscow. Russia was effectively split between two competing rulers, each claiming legitimacy. Foreign powers exploited the chaos. Poland-Lithuania, under King Sigismund III, saw an opportunity to extend Catholic influence and perhaps place a Polish prince on the Russian throne. Swedish forces also intervened, initially allied with Shuaiskai, as part of the broader Polish-Swedish rivalry. The Polish army entered Moscow in 1610 after Shuaiskai was deposed and forced into a monastery. For a time, the Polish Prince Władysław was proclaimed Tsar, though he never ruled effectively. Moscow itself fell under Polish occupation, and the Kremlin housed foreign troops. The Russian people, however, resisted foreign domination. Nationalist and religious sentiment stirred uprisings. In 1611, the first volunteer army was raised in Ryazan, led by Prince Dmitry Pozharsky and the merchant Kuzma Minin. Though their first attempt failed, a second force gathered in 1612 and marched on Moscow. In November, after a desperate siege, the Poles surrendered and the Kremlin was liberated. This moment was later celebrated as a national triumph, commemorated by the Feast of Our Lady of Kazan and the erection of a monument to Minin and Pozharsky in Red Square. The time of troubles formally ended with the election of a new dynasty. In 1613, Azemsky Sobor chose Mikhail Romanov, the 16-year-old son of Patriarch Filaret, as Tsar. His election restored stability by providing both dynastic legitimacy, as he was related by marriage to the Rurikids, and a figure acceptable to the nobility and church. The Romanov dynasty would rule Russia for the next 3 centuries. The time of troubles left deep scars on Russia. It exposed the fragility of the state, the volatility of peasant society, and the dangers of dynastic crisis. It also hardened a sense of national identity, forged in resistance to foreign occupation and the defense of orthodoxy. The boyars, though powerful, had proven incapable of uniting the realm. The church emerged as a rallying point, sanctifying the Romanov accession. For the peasantry, the chaos accelerated trends toward greater encirclement as rulers sought to tie laborers more firmly to the land to stabilize the economy. When the Romanov dynasty began in 1613, Russia was still reeling from the devastations of the time of troubles. The country had endured foreign intervention, dynastic collapse, and famine on a scale that had nearly broken the state. Mikhail Romanov, a 16-year-old boy chosen by the Zemsky Sobor, the National Assembly of nobles, clergy, and townspeople, ascended to the throne as the first Tsar of a new dynasty. His election was not accidental. Mikhail's family was connected to the old ruling house through his grandfather, who had been related by marriage to Ivan the Terrible, and his father, Patriarch Filaret, commanded influence within the Orthodox Church. Yet Mikhail's reign began under the shadow of Polish troops still occupying Smolensk and Swedish forces holding Novgorod. The dynasty's survival depended on restoring order to a fractured state and reasserting central control over vast lands that had nearly slipped away. The early Romanov Tsars, Mikhail R. 1613 to 1645, and his son Alexis R. 1645 to 1676, embarked on a slow process of stabilization. They relied heavily on the support of the boyar elite and the Orthodox Church, re-establishing institutions disrupted during the interregnum. Mikhail's reign was marked by pragmatism. He avoided unnecessary wars, negotiated peace with Sweden in 1617 through the Treaty of Stalbovo, which restored Novgorod, and ended hostilities with Poland in 1618 through the Truce of Delino, though Russia had to cede control of Smolensk, Chernihiv, and other western territories. These concessions underlined Russia's weakened position, but Mikhail's cautious diplomacy preserved the state and allowed the dynasty to consolidate its foundations. The Romanovs were not merely custodians of stability. They presided over gradual territorial expansion. By the mid-17th century, Russian explorers and Cossacks had driven eastward across the Urals into Siberia. This frontier was not settled in a rush, but in stages, as Russian traders, hunters, and Orthodox missionaries extended control over vast regions of forest and tundra. Fortresses were constructed along the Ob, Yenisei, and Lena rivers. By the 1630s and 1640s, Russian expeditions reached the Pacific Ocean, planting outposts on the Sea of Okhotsk. The conquest of Siberia was both a demographic and economic transformation. Tribute in the form of fur, yasak, became a crucial part of the imperial treasury, binding the indigenous peoples into the empire's orbit through coercion and taxation. By 1649, the establishment of the Russian settlement of Okhotsk demonstrated that Russia had become a transcontinental power. Domestically, Tsar Alexis implemented reforms that would have profound consequences. In 1649, the Sobornoye Yelazanai, or Law Code, was promulgated. This comprehensive legal code permanently enshrined serfdom in Russian society. While peasants had gradually lost freedom of movement since the late 16th century, the new code formally tied them to the land and gave landowners unprecedented control. Runaway peasants were to be pursued without a time limit, binding generations of rural laborers to estates. This codification of serfdom placed Russian society firmly within a feudal framework at a time when Western Europe was beginning to move away from such systems. The state benefited by ensuring that the agricultural base, which financed taxation and military service, remained stable. Yet it deepened the divide between the elite and the majority of the population, sowing the seeds of social unrest that would persist into the modern era. Religion also defined Alexis's reign. In the 1650s, Patriarch Nikon, a close ally of the Tsar, attempted to reform Orthodox liturgy to bring Russian practice into line with contemporary Greek usage. Seemingly minor alterations, such as the number of fingers used in making the sign of the cross or the spelling of Jesus' name, provoked bitter opposition. These reforms sparked the rascal, or schism, within the Russian Church. The dissenters, known as Old Believers, resisted Nikon's reforms and saw them as corruptions of the true faith. The Tsar and Patriarch responded with repression, exiling, and executing leaders of the opposition. The schism endured for centuries, creating a permanent religious undercurrent of resistance to state authority. The Old Believers were driven into remote areas, where they formed isolated communities that preserved their traditions. This fissure between church reformers and traditionalists demonstrated the profound cultural tensions of a society balancing change with conservatism. The 17th century was also punctuated by social unrest and rebellion. In the 1640s, Moscow witnessed the Salt Riot, sparked by unpopular taxes on salt. The more serious threat came in the 1670s with the uprising of Stenka Razin, a Cossack leader on the Don River. Razin capitalized on widespread peasant discontent and resentment against serfdom, gathering a force of Cossacks, runaway serfs, and disaffected townspeople. His rebellion swept through the Volga region, seizing cities such as Astrakhan, and proclaimed a vision of a more egalitarian order. Though Razin was eventually captured and executed in 1671, his revolt revealed the fragility of social stability under the weight of serfdom and autocracy. Following Alexis, the succession became complicated. His son Kyiv III reigned briefly from 1676 to 1682, attempting reforms but dying young. Power then passed into a fraught regency. Kyiv II's younger half-brother, Ivan V, was physically and mentally infirm, while his other half-brother, Peter, was still a child. Their sister, Sofia Alexievna, acted as regent from 1682 to 1689, ruling with the support of the elite Streltsy regiments. Her regency was marked by palace intrigue and factional struggle. Eventually, Peter overthrew Sofia's supporters and assumed effective power, though he nominally ruled alongside Ivan until Ivan died in 1696. From this turbulent succession emerged the figure who would transform Russia more than any czar before him, Peter the Great. Peter's reign, 1682 to 1725, marked a seismic shift in Russian history. Determined to modernize his country and force it onto the European stage, Peter embarked on reforms with a ferocity that astonished contemporaries. His early experience in the so-called German Quarter of Moscow exposed him to Western technology, navigation, and military practices. Obsessed with naval power, Peter traveled incognito to Western Europe in 1697 to 1698 during the Grand Embassy, studying shipbuilding in the Netherlands and England. Though forced to cut his journey short due to a Streltsy uprising in Moscow, the experience galvanized his determination to drag Russia out of what he perceived as backwardness. Upon his return, Peter initiated sweeping reforms. He reorganized the military along European lines, creating a standing army equipped with modern artillery. He founded Russia's first navy, constructed new industries to support war production, and introduced Western-style dress at court, compelling nobles to shave their traditional beards. His reforms extended into administration. Peter created a senate to supervise state affairs, established colleges, ministries, to manage specific functions, and imposed strict hierarchies of rank through the Table of Ranks in 1722, which tied noble status to state service. These changes aimed to break the independence of the old boyar aristocracy and bind them directly to the Tsar's authority. Peter's ambitions were not limited to domestic reform. He sought to make Russia a European great power through military conquest. His opportunity came in the Great Northern War, 1700 to 1721, where Russia confronted Sweden, then the dominant power in the Baltic. The war began disastrously for Russia, with a crushing defeat at Narva in 1700. Yet Peter persisted, reorganizing his army and gradually turning the tide. The decisive moment came in 1709 at the Battle of Poltava in Ukraine, where Russian forces annihilated the Swedish army of Charles XII. This victory marked Russia's emergence as a great power and secured access to the Baltic coast. The war dragged on until 1721, when the Treaty of Nystad granted Russia control of Estonia, Livonia, Ingria, and parts of Karelia, establishing Russia as the preeminent power in Northern Europe. Parallel to these military achievements, Peter undertook one of the most symbolic projects in Russian history, the construction of St. Petersburg. Founded in 1703 on marshland at the mouth of the Neva River, the new city was envisioned as Russia's window to Europe. Built at immense human cost, with thousands of serfs and conscripts laboring under harsh conditions, St. Petersburg became the new capital in 1712. Its European-style architecture, broad avenues, and proximity to the Baltic embodied Peter's vision of a modern, outward-facing Russia. The relocation of the capital from Moscow underscored the Tsar's determination to reorient the state culturally and geopolitically. Peter's reforms were transformative but also coercive. They were imposed from above, often violently, and met resistance from many quarters of society. The Church, stripped of its patriarchate in 1721, was subordinated directly to the state under the Holy Synod, effectively turning the clergy into an arm of government. Traditional customs were eroded, and the nobility chafed under the demands of lifelong service. Peasants bore the heaviest burden, enduring higher taxes and labor conscription. The modernization of Russia thus came not through voluntary adaptation, but through compulsion, setting a pattern of authoritarian reform that would recur throughout Russian history. In 1721, following the victory over Sweden, Peter formally assumed the title of Emperor of all Russia, declaring the Russian state an empire. His reign marked a turning point. Russia was no longer a peripheral kingdom vulnerable to collapse, but a centralized, militarized empire stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific. Yet by the time of his death in 1725, Peter had secured Russia's place among the great powers of Europe. He left behind not just a stronger state, but also unresolved tensions between modernization and tradition, central authority and local resistance, reform and repression. The Romanov dynasty, now firmly established, would carry these contradictions forward into the 18th century as Russia's empire expanded further and its society struggled under the weight of change. The death of Peter the Great in 1725 left Russia in a state of both triumph and uncertainty. His reforms had catapulted Russia onto the European stage as a formidable empire, but he had failed to secure a clear line of succession. His only son, Alexei, suspected of plotting against him, had been executed in 1718 under charges of treason. This left Peter's widow, Catherine I, as empress from 1725 until she died in 1727. Her reign, though brief, was significant in that it marked the beginning of a century in which Russia would often be ruled by palace intrigue, coups, and the decisive hand of the imperial guard. The structures Peter had created were strong, but the Romanov dynasty itself entered a period of instability, where emperors and empresses rose and fell as much through political maneuvering as through hereditary right. Catherine I, supported by Peter's closest advisors, the so-called Supreme Privy Council, ruled as a figurehead. Real power remained with men such as Alexander Menshikov, one of Peter's most trusted associates. Her brief reign saw little reform, but it underscored a crucial change in Russian politics. The throne could now pass to a woman, and succession could be contested not by primogeniture, but by force intrigue and alliances among the nobility and the army. Upon her death, the crown passed to Peter II, a grandson of Peter the Great, who reigned from 1727 to 1730. His reign was cut short by smallpox at the age of 14, plunging Russia once again into succession crises. The throne then fell to Anna Ivanovna, daughter of Peter the Great's half-brother Ivan V, who ruled from 1730 to 1740. Her reign reflected the dominance of court factions. Upon her accession, the Supreme Privy Council attempted to impose limits on her power, crafting conditions that would have transformed Russia into something resembling a constitutional monarchy. Yet Anna rejected these constraints, reasserting absolute power. Her court became notorious for its extravagance and for the heavy influence of German advisors, especially Ernst Johann von Biron, whose dominance provoked resentment among Russian nobles. This period highlighted one of the key features of 18th century Russia: the uneasy balance between foreign influences brought in through Peter's reforms and the native Russian aristocracy's suspicion of outsiders. Anna's death in 1740 ushered in another turbulent phase. Her infant grandnephew, Ivan VI, was named emperor, with Biron as regent. Within weeks, Biron was overthrown by rival nobles, and the child emperor was left powerless. By 1741, Elizabeth Petrovna, daughter of Peter the Great, seized power in a coup supported by the Imperial Guard. Ivan VI was imprisoned for life, eventually murdered in 1764 after an attempted rescue threatened to restore him. The fate of Ivan VI, imprisoned from infancy until his violent death, was a stark symbol of the brutal politics of succession that marked the century. Elizabeth's reign, 1741 to 1762, brought a degree of stability. She is remembered for restoring Russian identity at court, reversing some of the German dominance of Anna's period, and fostering culture and education. The University of Moscow was founded in 1755, and the Academy of Fine Arts followed in 1757, laying the foundations of Russia's intellectual life. Elizabeth also abolished the death penalty, a striking gesture in an otherwise autocratic system. Yet her reign was dominated by foreign affairs. Russia became deeply entangled in the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, and, more decisively, the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. During the latter conflict, Russian forces achieved remarkable successes against Frederick the Great of Prussia, even capturing Berlin in 1760. Yet Elizabeth's death in 1762 brought her nephew Peter III to the throne, and he promptly reversed Russia's gains, withdrawing from the war and making peace with Prussia. Peter III's reign was brief and disastrous. Married to the German Princess Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, who would later be known to history as Catherine the Great, Peter alienated the nobility by attempting to impose sweeping reforms too quickly and by his open admiration for Frederick of Prussia, Russia's recent enemy. He introduced the Manifesto on the Freedom of the Nobility, which exempted nobles from compulsory state service, a measure popular with elites but damaging to state control. Within months, his unpopular policies and erratic behavior led to his overthrow in a coup led by his wife. In July 1762, Peter was deposed and later killed under mysterious circumstances. His widow ascended the throne as Catherine II, remembered as Catherine the Great, beginning one of the most celebrated reigns in Russian history. Catherine the Great, 1762 to 1796, embodied the paradoxes of 18th century Russia. A German by birth, she embraced Russian identity with fervor, mastering the language, adopting orthodoxy, and presenting herself as a defender of Russian tradition. Yet she also corresponded with Enlightenment figures such as Voltaire, Diderot, and Montesquieu, cultivating an image as an enlightened despot. Her reign was marked by cultural flowering, legal reform, and above all, territorial expansion that transformed Russia into one of the great powers of Europe. Domestically, Catherine sought to modernize Russian governance. In 1767, she convened the Legislative Commission to draft a new code of laws, guided by her nakaz, or instruction, which drew heavily on Enlightenment principles. The nakaz called for equality before the law, the rejection of torture, and rational governance. Yet the commission, composed of delegates from across the empire, failed to produce a new code, as divisions between socialist states proved insurmountable. Still, Catherine's efforts reflected her desire to project herself as a reformer in the European mold. She also reformed provincial administration in 1775, dividing the empire into more manageable provinces with standardized bureaucracies, increasing the state's efficiency in governing vast territories. However, Catherine's enlightened image was contradicted by her policies toward the peasantry. Serfdom not only persisted but deepened under her rule. As she relied on the nobility for support, Catherine granted them greater control over their serfs, including the right to exile them to Siberia. The gulf between elite culture and peasant misery grew wider, setting the stage for social unrest. This tension exploded in 1773 to 1775 in the massive Pugachev Rebellion. Led by Emelian Pugachev, a Cossack who claimed to be the deposed Peter III, the revolt swept across the Volga region, uniting peasants, Cossacks, and minority groups under promises of liberation from serfdom. The rebellion captured major cities such as Kazan and threatened to topple Catherine's regime before being brutally suppressed. Tens of thousands were killed in reprisals. The rebellion exposed the fragility of Catherine's rule and hardened her reliance on the nobility, ensuring that serfdom remained entrenched. Catherine's reign was equally defined by foreign conquest. In a series of wars against the Ottoman Empire, she secured control over the northern Black Sea coast, Crimea, and access to warm water ports. The annexation of Crimea in 1783 was a landmark, expanding Russia's reach into the strategic Black Sea region. Simultaneously, Russia participated in the three partitions of Poland, 1772, 1793, and 1795, alongside Prussia and Austria. By the final partition, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth ceased to exist, and Russia gained vast territories, including much of modern Belarus, Ukraine, and Lithuania. These conquests not only expanded Russia's empire, but also brought millions of non-Russians, Poles, Jews, Muslims, and others under its rule, making the empire ever more multi-ethnic and complex to govern. Catherine also invested in cultural and intellectual life, turning St. Petersburg into a European capital of art and ideas. She patronized writers, founded schools for girls, and expanded the Hermitage collection. Her court became a symbol of enlightened monarchy, even as the reality of serfdom and autocracy remained harsh. By the end of her reign, Russia's power had grown immensely, but so too had the contradictions between enlightened ideals and oppressive practices. Catherine died in 1796, succeeded by her son Paul I, whose reign, 1796 to 1801, was short and unpopular. Paul sought to reverse many of his mother's policies, reasserting military discipline and alienating the nobility with erratic decrees. He attempted to establish a clear law of succession to the throne, ending the uncertainty that had plagued Russia for decades, but his autocratic style provoked widespread opposition. In 1801, he was assassinated in a palace coup, and his son, Alexander I, ascended the throne. By the end of the 18th century, Russia had been transformed. From the fragile state that emerged from the time of troubles, the Romanov dynasty had presided over a century of dramatic expansion, cultural change, and increasing engagement with Europe. Peter the Great had forced Russia into the European system of great powers, and Catherine the Great had solidified its position as a continental empire stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea and from Poland to the Pacific. Under Joseph Stalin's leadership, the Soviet Union entered a period that would define not only Russian history, but the trajectory of the 20th century. After Lenin died in 1924, the Bolshevik elite jostled for power in a struggle that pitted Leon Trotsky against rivals such as Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and ultimately Stalin himself. By 1929, Stalin had consolidated authority, marginalizing or exiling Trotsky, who was eventually assassinated in Mexico in 1940 on Stalin's orders, and placing himself at the helm of a state that claimed to embody Marxist ideals but increasingly reflected his personal dictatorship. From the end of the 1920s through the 1950s, Stalin's rule reshaped Russia through rapid industrialization, collectivization, political repression, and the cataclysm of the Second World War, while building the Soviet Union into a global superpower by the time of his death in 1953. The first major initiative of Stalin's government was the First Five-Year Plan, launched in 1928. It aimed to transform the Soviet Union from a largely agrarian society into an industrial powerhouse. Targets were set for steel, coal, iron, oil, and electricity, and the regime built entirely new industrial cities such as Magnitogorsk in the Ural Mountains. Heavy industry boomed, though often at enormous human cost. The state mobilized labor through coercion, relying on millions of forced workers in the Gulag system to construct railways, dams, and factories. The Second Five-Year Plan, 1933 to 1937, pushed industrial growth further, though it moderated the most unrealistic targets of the first. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union had become one of the world's largest industrial economies, producing vast quantities of steel, machinery, and armaments, an accomplishment that astonished foreign observers but came at immense human suffering. Parallel to industrialization, Stalin enforced the collectivization of agriculture beginning in 1929. Peasant households were compelled to join collective farms, known as kolkhozy, or state farms, known as sovkhozy. Wealthier peasants, labeled as kulaks, were declared class enemies, dispossessed, deported, or executed. Resistance to collectivization was widespread, and the destruction of livestock and crops contributed to disastrous shortages. The most infamous result was the famine of 1932 to 1933, which struck Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and parts of southern Russia. Known as the Holodomor in Ukraine, this famine killed millions. Estimates range between 3 and 7 million people. While natural factors played a role, the famine was largely man-made, caused by harsh requisition policies, forced grain exports, and the punishment of villages accused of hoarding. Stalin's insistence on meeting quotas regardless of human cost deepened the suffering, leaving scars on the rural population for generations. The 1930s were also marked by one of the most brutal episodes of state repression in modern history, the Great Terror. Between 1936 and 1938, Stalin orchestrated a wave of purges targeting the Communist Party, the military, the intelligentsia, and ordinary citizens. Show trials in Moscow convicted leading Bolsheviks such as Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Nikolai Bukharin of fabricated crimes, resulting in executions. The secret police, first the NKVD, arrested millions under suspicion of sabotage, espionage, or disloyalty. The Red Army itself was decimated. 3 of 5 marshals, most commanders, and thousands of officers were executed or imprisoned, leaving the military weakened on the eve of war. Overall, historians estimate that around 1.5 million people were executed or died in camps during the Great Terror, while millions more were imprisoned in the Gulag system. This climate of fear cemented Stalin's grip on power, ensuring loyalty but hollowing out much of the state's talent. Despite these horrors, Stalin also oversaw achievements that strengthened Soviet resilience in the decades to come. Literacy rates rose dramatically as the state expanded education. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Advances in science and engineering flourished, with Soviet projects in aeronautics, metallurgy, and physics laying the foundations for later space exploration. Moscow's monumental architecture, such as the Moscow Metro, opened in 1935, projected an image of modernity and grandeur, presenting the Soviet Union as a civilization both ancient and futuristic. The Soviet Union's foreign relations in the 1930s reflected Stalin's pragmatism. Initially, the USSR sought collective security against rising fascism in Europe. However, after Britain and France hesitated to confront Adolf Hitler, Stalin turned toward Germany. On August 23, 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed, a non-aggression treaty between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Secret protocols divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. The Baltic states, Eastern Poland, and parts of Romania were allocated to Soviet control. In September 1939, just weeks after Germany invaded Poland from the west, Soviet troops entered from the east, occupying territories that became part of the USSR. In 1940, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were annexed, as was Bessarabia from Romania. This uneasy partnership ended abruptly on June 22, 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. The Wehrmacht advanced rapidly, capturing vast territories and besieging Leningrad in September 1941. Moscow itself came under direct threat that winter. The Soviet Union reeled under the assault, suffering immense losses, millions of soldiers captured, entire armies destroyed, and civilians subjected to atrocities. Yet Stalin's government responded by mobilizing resources with ferocity. Factories were relocated eastward beyond the Ural Mountains, producing tanks, aircraft, and weapons. The Red Army regrouped, and in December 1941, with reinforcements and the onset of winter, Soviet forces launched a counteroffensive that pushed the Germans back from Moscow. The war years, known in Russia as the Great Patriotic War, became the crucible of Soviet identity. The Siege of Leningrad, lasting from September 1941 to January 1944, starved the city's population, killing around 1 million civilians, but the city never surrendered. The Battle of Stalingrad, August 1942 to February 1943, marked a turning point. After months of brutal urban combat, Soviet forces encircled and annihilated the German Sixth Army, inflicting Hitler's first major defeat. From that point, the Red Army moved westward, reclaiming territory and advancing into Eastern Europe. By May 1945, Soviet troops stormed Berlin, raising the red flag over the Reichstag. The victory came at staggering cost. The Soviet Union lost around 27 million people, both soldiers and civilians, by far the highest casualties of any nation in the war. Emerging victorious from World War II, the Soviet Union became a superpower alongside the United States. Stalin extended Soviet influence across Eastern Europe, establishing communist regimes in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. By 1949, the world had entered the Cold War, a bipolar struggle between capitalist and communist blocs. The Soviets tested their first atomic bomb in 1949, ending America's monopoly on nuclear weapons. Domestically, Stalin tightened repression once more, launching new purges in the late 1940s, targeting perceived ideological deviation and national minorities. Anti-Semitic campaigns surfaced under the guise of combating cosmopolitanism. Yet at the same time, Soviet prestige soared, with the USSR celebrated for its role in defeating fascism and for its rapid recovery after the war. Stalin died on March 5, 1953, after suffering a stroke. His death left the Soviet Union at a crossroads, a nation transformed into an industrial and military giant, but deeply scarred by decades of repression, famine, and war. For some, Stalin remained the man who had modernized Russia and led it to victory against Hitler. For others, he was the architect of mass terror and suffering. His legacy has remained deeply contested, both within Russia and worldwide. But it is beyond question that his rule marked a decisive era in Russian history, one that defined the contours of the Soviet Union for decades and altered the course of the modern world. The death of Joseph Stalin in March 1953 marked the end of an era and opened a complex new chapter in the history of the Soviet Union. For nearly 3 decades, Stalin had personified Soviet power, and his sudden absence left the state in a delicate transition. A collective leadership initially emerged, with figures such as Georgy Malenkov, Lavrentiy Beria, Vyacheslav Molotov, and Nikita Khrushchev vying for influence. Beria, head of the secret police, was quickly arrested and executed in December 1953, a move that signaled the others' determination to prevent a new dictatorship from forming under the feared security apparatus. Malenkov sought to steer policy toward consumer goods and easing tensions with the West, but by 1955, Khrushchev had maneuvered his way to the top of the Communist Party, becoming first secretary, and by 1958 consolidating power as premier as well. Khrushchev's rule inaugurated a period known as the Thaw, a time of relative liberalization after the suffocating repression of Stalinism. The defining moment came in February 1956, during the 20th Party Congress, when Khrushchev delivered his secret. Domestically, Khrushchev attempted reforms. Censorship was somewhat relaxed, allowing literature by figures such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whose One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, 1962, exposed the Gulag experience. Millions of political prisoners were released from camps. Khrushchev promoted a Virgin Lands campaign beginning in 1954, seeking to expand agricultural production by cultivating lands in Kazakhstan and Siberia. While initially successful, the scheme faltered in the long term due to poor soil management and erosion. Housing construction accelerated, with prefabricated apartment blocks, the Khrushchevka, providing millions of families with their first private living spaces. Education expanded, and emphasis was placed on science and technology, laying the groundwork for advances in space exploration. On the world stage, Khrushchev presided over some of the Cold War's most dramatic confrontations. In 1956, Soviet tanks crushed the Hungarian Revolution, where calls for independence and political liberalization threatened Moscow's hold on Eastern Europe. Khrushchev made clear that the Soviet bloc would not tolerate defection from its orbit. reinforcing the principle of Soviet dominance later formalized in the Brezhnev Doctrine. In 1957, the Soviet Union stunned the world by launching Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, marking the beginning of the space race. This achievement showcased the USSR's technological prowess and elevated its global prestige, though it also triggered American alarm and increased Cold War rivalry. Relations with China, however, began to sour during Khrushchev's leadership. Mao Zedong resented Khrushchev's criticism of Stalin and his calls for peaceful coexistence with the West. The Sino-Soviet split, which unfolded through the late 1950s and early 1960s, fractured the communist world and weakened the Soviet Union's ideological leadership. Meanwhile, ties with the United States oscillated between confrontation and tentative diplomacy. Khrushchev met President Dwight Eisenhower in 1959 and even toured America, projecting a more human face of Soviet leadership. But tensions escalated in 1960 when an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Soviet territory, scuttling a planned summit. The Cold War reached its most dangerous moment under Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 and the deployment of American missiles in Turkey, the Soviet Union secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, only 90 miles from U.S. shores. When American reconnaissance discovered them, President John F. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade. For 13 tense days, the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war. Ultimately, Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for U.S. assurances not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey. While the crisis ended peacefully, Khrushchev's perceived retreat damaged his standing within the Soviet leadership, even as it highlighted the perils of nuclear brinkmanship. By the mid-1960s, dissatisfaction with Khrushchev mounted. His erratic style, repeated reorganizations of the party and state, and failures in agriculture alienated many within the leadership. In October 1964, he was quietly removed from power in a party coup and replaced by Leonid Brezhnev as general secretary, with Alexei Kosygin as premier. Unlike Khrushchev's dynamic, often unpredictable leadership, Brezhnev represented a more conservative, collective approach that emphasized stability over experimentation. The Brezhnev era, lasting from 1964 until he died in 1982, became associated with both Soviet power at its zenith and with growing stagnation. Brezhnev reversed many of Khrushchev's decentralizing reforms, restoring authority to central ministries and reinforcing the role of the Communist Party. Censorship tightened once more, and dissidents such as Andrei Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn faced harassment, exile, or imprisonment. While the worst of Stalinist terror did not return, repression remained a constant feature, maintaining control but stifling intellectual and political life. Economically, the Soviet Union experienced steady growth during the late 1960s and early 1970s, aided by oil exports that surged during the 1973 oil crisis. Living standards modestly improved, with greater access to consumer goods, housing, and education than in previous decades. Yet systemic inefficiencies persisted. Central planning bred waste, corruption, and low productivity. By the mid-1970s, growth slowed dramatically, inaugurating what came to be known as the era of stagnation. Technological innovation lagged behind the West, and attempts at reform were half-hearted or shelved, leaving structural problems unresolved. Internationally, Brezhnev presided over both détente and renewed confrontation with the United States. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, détente sought to ease Cold War tensions. Treaties such as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT I, 1972, capped the nuclear arms race, and agreements on trade and scientific cooperation opened limited exchanges. In 1975, the Helsinki Accords, signed by the Soviet Union and Western nations, recognized European borders established after World War II while committing signatories to human rights principles, a provision that Soviet dissidents would later invoke against their government. At the same time, Brezhnev asserted Soviet dominance over the Eastern Bloc through the Brezhnev Doctrine, articulated after the Prague Spring of 1968. When Czechoslovakia under Alexander Dubček attempted liberal reforms and greater independence, Soviet and Warsaw Pact forces invaded in August 1968 to restore orthodoxy. Brezhnev declared that the USSR had the right to intervene in socialist countries to preserve communism, effectively denying sovereignty within the bloc. This doctrine guided Soviet policy until the late 1980s. The Soviet military buildup under Brezhnev was immense. Defense spending consumed a large share of the economy, and the USSR achieved nuclear parity with the United States. Soviet influence expanded globally, supporting socialist governments in Africa, aiding movements in Asia and Latin America, and projecting power through proxy wars. The pinnacle of this assertiveness came in December 1979, when Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan to support a faltering communist regime in Kabul. The invasion sparked fierce resistance from Afghan Mujahideen fighters, who were supplied by the United States, Pakistan, and other allies. The Afghan war drained Soviet resources, cost tens of thousands of lives, and tarnished Moscow's international image, becoming the USSR's Vietnam. By the late 1970s, détente unraveled as the U.S. under President Jimmy Carter and later Ronald Reagan adopted harder lines, particularly after Afghanistan and the Soviet deployment of SS-20 missiles in Europe. The Soviet Union found itself locked once more in an expensive, escalating confrontation with the West. Meanwhile, Brezhnev's health deteriorated. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, he was visibly infirm, presiding over a gerontocratic leadership unable to adapt. When he died in November 1982, the Soviet Union was a formidable military power but internally brittle, weighed down by economic stagnation, corruption, and a political system resistant to reform. Thus, from Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin in 1956 through Brezhnev's death in 1982, the Soviet Union experienced dramatic swings, from liberalization and global prestige in the space race to authoritarian retrenchment and stagnation, from nuclear brinkmanship in Cuba to détente and arms control, from the hopeful promises of socialism to the sobering reality of inefficiency and overextension. This period preserved Soviet dominance at home and abroad, but left deep structural flaws that would soon come to the forefront under Brezhnev's short-lived successors, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, and ultimately Mikhail Gorbachev. The death of Leonid Brezhnev on November 10, 1982, brought to an end 18 years of his leadership and marked the beginning of a short but significant transitional period in Soviet history. Brezhnev's era had given the Soviet Union stability and international prestige, but it also left behind deep economic stagnation, a rigid political structure, and an aging ruling elite. Into this vacuum stepped Yuri Andropov, a former head of the KGB who became General Secretary of the Communist Party. Andropov, who had overseen repression in Hungary in 1956 and led the secret police from 1967 to 1982, was a paradoxical figure. Both a hardliner and a realist, he understood the systemic weaknesses of the USSR more clearly than many of his colleagues. Andropov assumed leadership in November 1982 at the age of 68, already suffering from serious kidney failure. Despite his poor health, he embarked on a program to discipline the Soviet system. He cracked down on corruption, absenteeism, and inefficiency, launching campaigns to improve labor discipline by checking factories, offices, and even movie theaters for truant workers. He recognized that the Soviet Union was lagging technologically and attempted to encourage limited innovation in electronics and computing. He also promoted younger officials, including Mikhail Gorbachev, signaling a recognition that the old guard could not lead indefinitely. In foreign policy, Andropov continued Brezhnev's line of confrontation with the United States, which under Ronald, his successor, Konstantin Chernenko, was another elderly party veteran. Chernenko, 72 at the time of his elevation, had been a close ally of Brezhnev and represented a return to the older, conservative style of leadership. His selection in February 1984 reflected the party's reluctance to risk real change. Chernenko was already gravely ill with emphysema and heart disease when he took office, and his short tenure was marked by paralysis. He largely reversed Andropov's modest attempts at reform, restoring old policies and emphasizing ideological orthodoxy. Chernenko's rule saw continued tension with the West, though by this time, Soviet leaders had grown more open to the idea of resuming arms control negotiations. Yet Chernenko was too weak to push through new initiatives. Domestically, the problems of corruption, declining growth, and popular cynicism deepened. He died on March 10, 1985, barely 13 months after assuming office. His passing underscored the crisis of leadership within the Communist Party. 3 general secretaries had died within less than 3 years, and the system could no longer be sustained by elderly, infirm leaders. This set the stage for a dramatic generational shift. On March 11, 1985, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, at just 54 years old, was elected General Secretary of the Communist Party. Gorbachev, who had risen through the party ranks under Andropov's patronage, was the first Soviet leader born after the Bolshevik Revolution. He brought with him a fresh perspective and an urgency to confront the crises facing the USSR. Gorbachev recognized that the Soviet Union could not compete indefinitely with the West while shackled by economic stagnation and bureaucratic sclerosis. He introduced 2 key concepts: perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. Perestroika sought to reform the Soviet economy by introducing limited market mechanisms, decentralizing planning, and encouraging enterprise initiative. From 1987 onward, state enterprises were given more autonomy. Cooperatives and joint ventures with foreign companies were legalized, and elements of private trade began to reemerge. However, these reforms were inconsistent, caught between central control and market freedom, leading to shortages, inflation, and disarray rather than revival. Glasnost, introduced around 1986, was even more transformative. It loosened censorship, encouraged public discussion, and exposed past crimes of the Soviet regime. For the first time, Soviet citizens openly debated the Stalinist purges, corruption, and the inefficiencies of the system. Newspapers began publishing material once unthinkable, and writers such as Solzhenitsyn were rehabilitated. Television and media flourished in new ways, while the state attempted to present itself as accountable. This openness unleashed forces that would prove impossible to control, fueling demands for greater democracy and even independence in non-Russian republics. Gorbachev also pursued significant foreign policy changes under the banner of New Thinking. He sought to ease tensions with the United States and reduce the military burden that consumed so much of the Soviet budget. A key breakthrough came with the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, signed in December 1987 with President Ronald Reagan, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. Gorbachev also reduced Soviet support for proxy wars abroad and began the process of withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, completed by February 1989. His reforms initially brought optimism. Western leaders praised Gorbachev, seeing him as a partner for peace. He received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990. But at home, the impact of perestroika was destabilizing. Economic output declined, shortages worsened, and consumer discontent grew. glasnost emboldened nationalist movements across the USSR. In the Baltic republics, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, mass demonstrations demanded independence. In Georgia, Armenia, Ukraine, and Central Asia, ethnic tensions flared, sometimes erupting into violence. By 1989, the pressure on Soviet control in Eastern Europe became unsustainable. Gorbachev's decision not to use force to uphold the Brezhnev Doctrine had profound consequences. In 1989, communist regimes collapsed across Eastern Europe in rapid succession. Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania all saw the fall of their ruling parties. The Berlin Wall came down in November 1989, symbolizing the end of the Cold War division of Europe. Inside the USSR, reformers pushed further. In 1989, Gorbachev allowed the first relatively free elections to the Congress of People's Deputies. Opposition figures such as Boris Yeltsin gained prominence. Yeltsin, a former party leader in Moscow turned critic of the communist establishment, won mass popularity for calling out corruption and championing Russian sovereignty. By 1990, he was elected chairman of the Russian Supreme Soviet, making him the most powerful politician in the Russian Republic. In 1990, the Communist Party faced a severe crisis of legitimacy. Gorbachev removed Article 6 of the Soviet Constitution, which had guaranteed the Communist Party's monopoly on power. Multi-party politics emerged, and republics began declaring sovereignty. In June 1990, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic proclaimed that its laws took precedence over those of the USSR, a direct challenge to the Union's integrity. The economic situation spiraled further. By 1991, the Soviet Union was in crisis, with inflation, shortages, and declining industrial output. Gorbachev attempted to negotiate a new Union treaty to transform the USSR into a looser federation, granting more autonomy to the republics. Hardline communists, fearing the dissolution of central power, moved to stop him. On August 19, 1991, a group of conservative officials launched a coup against Gorbachev while he was vacationing in Crimea. Tanks rolled into Moscow, but the coup collapsed within 3 days due to popular resistance led by Boris Yeltsin, who famously stood on a tank outside the Russian parliament building to rally support. The failure of the coup fatally weakened the Communist Party and accelerated the collapse of the USSR. In December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the Belovezh Accords, declaring the Soviet Union dissolved and establishing the Commonwealth of Independent States. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the USSR, and the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union ceased to exist after 69 years. Thus, the years between 1982 and 1991 encapsulated the final crisis of the Soviet system. From Andropov's recognition of decay, through Chernenko's stagnation, to Gorbachev's ambitious but destabilizing reforms, the Soviet Union unraveled. Economic breakdown, nationalist resurgence, and the failure of political compromise ended one of the 20th century's superpowers. In its place arose a new Russian Federation under Boris Yeltsin, carrying forward both the weight of Soviet legacies and the challenges of building a new state. The collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991 thrust the Russian Federation into a turbulent and uncertain new era. For the first time since the 14th century, the Kremlin presided only over Russia itself, no longer at the head of a vast empire. Boris Yeltsin, elected president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic in June 1991, suddenly found himself head of a sovereign Russian state. He assumed office as the USSR structures dissolved around him. The Communist Party collapsed in disrepute, and 15 new states emerged from the fragments of the former Soviet Empire. Yeltsin inherited a country exhausted by decades of stagnation, economic inefficiency, and political repression, but one filled with hopes for democracy, market reform, and integration with the world. The early 1990s represented both a moment of radical transformation and a period of profound crisis. Yeltsin and his allies embarked on a rapid program of economic liberalization known as shock therapy. Guided by economists such as Yegor Gaidar, the government abolished price controls, freed trade, and sought to privatize state-owned industries on a massive scale. The hope was to dismantle the command economy quickly, prevent a return to communism, and create a dynamic market system. On January 2, 1992, most prices were liberalized, triggering immediate and dramatic inflation. In a single year, prices rose by over 2,000%, wiping out savings and devastating living standards. Goods once subsidized by the state became unaffordable for ordinary people, while shortages persisted. Privatization unfolded through a voucher system introduced in 1992 to 1994, in which citizens received certificates that could be exchanged for shares in formerly state-owned enterprises. In theory, this would distribute ownership broadly. In practice, most people, desperate for cash, sold their vouchers cheaply, often to insiders or speculators. A small group of well-connected businessmen acquired vast assets in oil, gas, and industry, becoming the oligarchs who dominated Russia's economy and politics throughout the 1990s. Companies like Gazprom, Lukoil, and Yukos fell into private hands at fractions of their value. While a new capitalist class enriched itself, much of the population sank into poverty. By 1994, nearly a third of Russians lived below the poverty line, and inequality soared. Politically, in December 1993, a new constitution was adopted by referendum, granting the president sweeping powers. Russia was formally declared a federal, democratic state with separation of powers, but in practice, Yeltsin now held greater authority than any leader since Stalin. The parliament was reconstituted as the State Duma and the Federation Council, with weaker oversight capacities. This concentration of power set the stage for Russia's later trajectory, where presidential dominance became entrenched. The mid-1990s brought continued economic hardship. In 1994 to 1996, Russia experienced a sharp decline in GDP, mass unemployment, and the collapse of social services. Average life expectancy dropped, with male life expectancy falling to just 58 years by the mid-1990s. Alcoholism, crime, and corruption flourished. Organized crime syndicates, the mafia, infiltrated politics, business, and daily life. In many regions, the authority of the central state seemed tenuous, while governors and local elites carved out autonomy. The most serious challenge to Russian sovereignty came from Chechnya, a republic in the North Caucasus. In November 1991, Chechen separatists under Jakhar Dudayev declared independence from Russia. Yeltsin, unwilling to allow secession, launched a military intervention in December 1994. The First Chechen War quickly descended into disaster for the Russian army, which was poorly trained, underfunded, and plagued by corruption. Grozny, the Chechen capital, was devastated by bombardment, and civilian casualties mounted. Despite overwhelming firepower, Russian forces struggled against determined guerrilla resistance. The war became deeply unpopular at home, seen as senseless and brutal. By 1996, facing mounting losses and domestic opposition, Yeltsin agreed to a ceasefire. The Khasavyurt Accord, signed in August 1996, effectively granted Chechnya de facto independence, though its final status remained unresolved. This humiliating war underscored the fragility of the Russian state. Yet Yeltsin managed to win re-election in 1996 in a contest that revealed the new dynamics of post-Soviet politics. Initially polling in single digits, Yeltsin turned to oligarchic financiers and media tycoons, who mobilized resources to secure his victory. State-run television painted Yeltsin as the only alternative to a return of communism, embodied by his challenger, Gennady Zhuganov of the Communist Party. Despite a weak economy and widespread dissatisfaction, Yeltsin won with 54% of the vote in the runoff. However, his health was failing. He underwent heart surgery later that year, and his reliance on oligarchs further eroded legitimacy. The late 1990s saw Russia beset by recurring crises. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 reverberated in Moscow, and in August 1998, Russia suffered a catastrophic default. The ruble collapsed, banks failed, and inflation wiped out savings yet again. The government defaulted on its debt, and the middle class, still fragile, was devastated. For many, this was the low point of the post-Soviet transition, reinforcing perceptions that reforms had brought ruin rather than renewal. Meanwhile, Chechnya remained unstable, devolving into lawlessness, warlordism, and Islamic radicalism. Kidnapping and terrorism spread throughout the North Caucasus. In 1999, incursions by Chechen fighters into neighboring Dagestan, coupled with a wave of apartment bombings in Russian cities that killed hundreds, prompted a renewed military campaign. This marked the beginning of the Second Chechen War. By then, Yeltsin's authority had collapsed. His approval ratings sank to single digits, and questions about succession dominated Russian politics. In August 1999, Yeltsin appointed Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer and head of the Federal Security Service, FSB, as prime minister. Putin projected an image of decisiveness and order, contrasting with Yeltsin's erratic leadership. As Russian forces advanced into Chechnya in late 1999, Putin's hardline stance won public support. On December 31, 1999, Yeltsin unexpectedly resigned, declaring, "I am tired. I have done all I could." He handed power to Putin, who became the acting president. Thus, the decade from 1991 to 1999 was one of upheaval, where Russia lurched from communism to capitalism, from dictatorship to fragile democracy, and from empire to uncertain federation. Yeltsin's years brought real achievements: the establishment of electoral politics, freedom of speech, and the beginnings of a market economy. Yet they also left legacies of corruption, inequality, oligarchic dominance, regional instability, and public disillusionment. Russia emerged from the 1990s battered and weary, longing for stability, order, and restored pride. These were the conditions that prepared the ground for Vladimir Putin, whose rise at the turn of the millennium marked the next decisive phase in Russia's modern history. When Vladimir Putin assumed the presidency on December 31, 1999, following Boris Yeltsin's surprise resignation, Russia was a country in profound crisis. The 1990s had been marked by economic collapse, political chaos, and two bloody wars in Chechnya. Russia's people were weary of instability, corruption, and the humiliation of lost superpower status. Putin, a former KGB officer who had risen rapidly through the ranks of Yeltsin's administration, projected an image of order, decisiveness, and control that resonated with the public. His first months in power coincided with the renewed war in Chechnya, and he used the conflict to forge his reputation as a strong leader who would defend Russia's territorial integrity and restore its dignity. The Second Chechen War, launched in late 1999, was prosecuted with far greater intensity than the first. Following incursions into Dagestan by Chechen militants led by Shamil Basayev and Ibn al-Khattab, and a series of apartment bombings in Moscow and other Russian cities in September 1999 that killed more than 300 people blamed on Chechen terrorists, but whose origins remain controversial, Putin vowed to eliminate terrorism with uncompromising force. Russian troops re-entered Chechnya in October 1999, laying siege to Grozny. By February 2000, after weeks of intense bombardment, the capital was reduced to rubble and retaken by Russian forces. Unlike in the 1994 to 1996 conflict, Moscow maintained control, gradually installing a loyal Chechen leadership under Akhmat Kadyrov, and later his son, Ramzan. The war formally continued until 2009, but by the early 2000s, the separatist movement was broken, though at immense human cost, with tens of thousands of civilian deaths. For many Russians, however, Putin's ruthless handling of the conflict confirmed that he was the man to restore order. In March 2000, Putin was elected president with 53% of the vote, securing a first-round victory. His priorities were clear: re-centralize authority, stabilize the economy, and curb the influence of the oligarchs who had dominated under Yeltsin. He sought to rebuild the vertical of power, ensuring that regional governors and local elites were subordinated to the Kremlin. In 2000, he introduced reforms requiring governors to be appointed by the president and approved by regional legislatures, effectively ending the semi-autonomy many regions had enjoyed in the 1990s. Federal districts were established, each overseen by a presidential representative, often with security service backgrounds. This reassertion of central control reversed the centrifugal trends that had threatened Russia's cohesion. Putin also confronted the oligarchs. Under Yeltsin, figures like Boris Berezovsky, Vladimir Guzinsky, and Mikhail Khodorkovsky had wielded enormous political influence through their control of media empires and vast economic holdings. Putin made it clear that their political interference would no longer be tolerated. Berezovsky and Guzinsky were pressured into exile, while Khodorkovsky, head of the oil giant Yukos, was arrested in 2003 on charges of fraud and tax evasion after funding opposition parties and NGOs. Yukos was dismantled, and its assets transferred largely to state-controlled companies, most prominently Rosneft. This marked the beginning of what analysts called state capitalism, where key sectors of the economy, particularly energy, were consolidated under government or Kremlin-linked corporations. At the same time, Russia's economy began to recover. The early 2000s coincided with a surge in global oil prices, a boon for a country whose revenues depended heavily on hydrocarbons. Between 1999 and 2008, Russia's GDP grew at an average rate of 7% annually. Inflation fell, and poverty rates declined significantly. Foreign investment increased, and Moscow experienced a construction boom. Ordinary Russians, who had endured the deprivations of the 1990s, saw rising incomes, improved living standards, and consumer goods becoming widely available. By 2007, Russia's GDP had grown sixfold compared to its 1999 level, and foreign currency reserves reached record highs. For many citizens, this economic revival cemented Putin's legitimacy. Putin also cultivated an ideology of stability, patriotism, and restored national pride. He called the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, a phrase that became central to his worldview. While he did not seek to internationally, the early years of Putin's presidency were marked by a complex relationship with the West. After the September 11, 2001 attacks, Putin was the first foreign leader to call U.S. President George W. Bush, offering support in the War on Terror. Russia allowed American use of Central Asian bases during the invasion of Afghanistan and toned down objections to NATO's role. In 2002, Russia and the U.S. signed the Strategic Offensive Reductions Treaty, cutting nuclear arsenals. However, tensions soon re-emerged. The U.S. withdrawal from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002, and NATO's expansion in 2004 to include the Baltic states, former Soviet republics, deeply alarmed Moscow. Putin interpreted these moves as encirclement. The U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, opposed by Russia, further strained relations. Putin's second presidential term, beginning in 2004, consolidated these trends. Domestically, he faced challenges such as the Beslan school siege in September 2004, when Chechen militants took over 1,100 hostages in North Ossetia. The siege ended in chaos when Russian forces stormed the school, leaving over 330 dead, many of them children. The tragedy shocked the nation and prompted Putin to tighten security measures further, abolishing the direct election of governors in favor of presidential appointment, a move justified as a necessity for stability but criticized as authoritarian. Meanwhile, Russia's assertiveness abroad grew. In Ukraine, the 2004 Orange Revolution, sparked by protests against electoral fraud favoring the Kremlin-backed candidate Viktor Yanukovych, brought pro-Western Viktor Yushchenko to power. For Moscow, this was an alarming sign of Western-backed color revolutions, undermining Russian influence in its near abroad. Similar movements in Georgia in 2003 and Kyrgyzstan in 2005 reinforced this perception. Putin began promoting the Eurasian Economic Community and strengthening ties with Belarus and Kazakhstan to counterbalance Western influence. By 2007, Putin openly signaled a more confrontational stance. At the Munich Security Conference that February, he delivered a speech condemning U.S. unipolarity and NATO expansion as threats to global stability. This marked the clearest declaration of his intention to challenge the Western-led order. That same year, Russia experienced domestic tensions with massive protests against corruption, though these were contained by the police. Putin's constitutionally limited 2 consecutive terms ended in 2008. Rather than altering the constitution outright, he orchestrated a castling maneuver with his loyal ally Dmitry Medvedev. Medvedev ran for president, winning easily, while Putin became prime minister. Although Medvedev promoted modernization and spoke of liberalization, it was widely understood that real power remained with Putin. The defining event of 2008 was the war with Georgia. In August, after escalating clashes in South Ossetia, Russian forces intervened, crushing Georgian troops in a 5-day conflict. Russian troops advanced deep into Georgian territory before withdrawing, while Moscow recognized South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states. This was the first post-Soviet war where Russia directly asserted military power beyond its borders, sending a signal to both its neighbors and the West. By the close of the first decade of the 21st century, Putin had transformed Russia from the unstable, fragmented state of the 1990s into a more centralized, economically resurgent, and internationally assertive power. Yet this came at the price of shrinking democratic space, increased state control over society, and a reliance on energy revenues that left the country vulnerable to global price swings. The duality of stability and repression, prosperity and dependence, would define Russia as it entered the 2010s, with Putin poised to return formally to the presidency. When Vladimir Putin announced in September 2011 that he would return to the presidency after Dmitry Medvedev's single term, many Russians were unsurprised, but for others it confirmed suspicions that their political system had become little more than a carefully managed stage. The castling maneuver, Putin resumed the presidency in 2012 while Medvedev stepped aside to serve as prime minister, symbolized the dominance of Putinism. Yet the moment also unleashed discontent. Parliamentary elections in December 2011, marred by allegations of fraud in favor of the ruling United Russia Party, ignited some of the largest street protests in Russia since the early 1990s. In Moscow, on Bolotnaya Square, tens of thousands rallied against corruption, authoritarianism, and stagnation, waving banners that read, "Russia without Putin." The Kremlin responded cautiously at first, tolerating demonstrations, but as 2012 progressed, crackdowns intensified. Leaders of the protest movement were harassed, arrested, or forced into exile, while new laws restricted public gatherings, NGOs, and foreign-funded organizations. In March 2012, Putin officially reclaimed the presidency with 63% of the vote, though international observers criticized the election as neither fully free nor fair. His inauguration in May was accompanied by mass protests violently dispersed by police. Meanwhile, domestic politics hardened further. Opposition leader Alexei Navalny rose to prominence by exposing corruption through online investigations, including his 2017 film, He Is Not Diamond to You, which accused Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev of amassing hidden wealth. Navalny's activities mobilized young Russians, leading to nationwide protests. The Kremlin responded with arrests, censorship, and repeated attempts to sideline Navalny, including barring him from the 2018 presidential election. That election, held in March 2018, gave Putin a fourth presidential term with 76% of the vote. While turnout and results were questioned, it was clear that no serious alternative was permitted. Russia had by then shifted toward what scholars termed electoral authoritarianism. Formal democratic institutions existed, but outcomes were tightly managed. The same year, Putin announced sweeping reforms to Russia's nuclear arsenal, boasting of new strategic weapons, underscoring his defiant stance toward the West. The late 2010s, however, exposed cracks. Economic growth slowed, real incomes declined, and discontent simmered. A deeply unpopular pension reform in 2018, raising the retirement age, eroded public trust. Regional protests erupted over issues like waste disposal, corruption, and declining living standards. Yet the Kremlin relied on a mixture of repression and propaganda to contain dissent. The most dramatic escalation came in 2020. That summer, Putin oversaw a constitutional referendum allowing him to reset term limits, potentially enabling him to remain in power until 2036. Officially, 78% voted in favor, though the process was criticized as manipulated. The reform underscored Putin's intent to preserve his rule indefinitely. Later that year, Navalny was poisoned with a Novichok nerve agent during a trip to Siberia in an attack widely attributed to Russian security services. After recovering in Germany, Navalny returned to Russia in January 2021, only to be arrested immediately. His imprisonment sparked protests, which were met with mass detentions and severe crackdowns. At the same time, Russia deepened its confrontation with the West. Tensions with NATO over military exercises grew, and Moscow backed Belarusian strongman Alexander Lukashenko during the 2020 protests following a disputed election. In Ukraine, ceasefire agreements in Donbass repeatedly failed, while Russia continued to arm and sustain separatist forces. By early 2022, the confrontation culminated in the most consequential decision of Putin's era, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. On February 24th, Russian forces launched a multi-front assault, aiming to topple Kyiv's government within days. The war, however, proved far more protracted and costly than anticipated. Fierce Ukrainian resistance, backed by Western military aid, blunted Russia's advances. The invasion triggered unprecedented Western sanctions, isolating Russia economically and diplomatically, while NATO unity was reinvigorated. For Putin, the war was framed as a defense of Russia against NATO encroachment and the West's attempt to dominate the post-Soviet space. For much of the world, it marked Russia's transformation into a pariah state. By the end of Putin's third and fourth presidential terms, Russia had undergone profound transformations. Its political system was centralized around one man, its foreign policy defined by confrontation, and its society reshaped by nationalism and conservative ideology. The economic stability of the early 2000s had given way to stagnation under sanctions, yet the Kremlin maintained control through repression and the constant evocation of external threats. Russia had returned as a great power, but at immense cost, embroiling itself in wars, isolation, and internal suppression. When Russian tanks rolled across Ukraine's borders on February 24, 2022, the world witnessed the largest land invasion in Europe since World War II. Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation aimed at the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, framing the assault as a defensive measure against NATO expansion and Western encroachment. Yet for most of the world, it was a war of aggression designed to erase Ukraine's sovereignty and restore Moscow's imperial sphere of influence. Within hours, missiles struck Kyiv, Kharkiv, and other cities, while troops poured in from Russia, Belarus, and the Russian-occupied Donbass. The Kremlin anticipated a swift collapse of Ukraine's government. Instead, it encountered a nation galvanized by survival and led by a president, Volodymyr Zelensky, who refused to flee. His simple declaration, "I need ammunition, not a ride," became symbolic of Ukraine's defiance. The initial phase of the war revealed miscalculations at every level of Russia's planning. Poor logistics, low morale among conscripts, and fierce Ukrainian resistance stalled the offensive on Kyiv. By April 2022, Russia withdrew from northern Ukraine, having failed in its attempt to decapitate the government. What followed was a shift in strategy, a grinding war of attrition focused on the Donbass and southern Ukraine. Cities such as Mariupol became symbols of devastation. After a brutal siege, Mariupol fell in May 2022, leaving tens of thousands dead, with reports of mass graves and atrocities committed against civilians. The war quickly reshaped global geopolitics. Western nations imposed unprecedented sanctions on Russia, freezing hundreds of billions of dollars in reserves, banning technology exports, and targeting oligarchs linked to the Kremlin. The European Union, long dependent on Russian gas, began a painful but determined pivot to alternative energy sources. Germany, abandoning decades of cautious policy, announced a historic increase in military spending. NATO, previously divided, found renewed purpose. Finland and Sweden applied for membership, shattering decades of neutrality. For Moscow, this was the opposite of its intended outcome. Instead of halting NATO's advance, the invasion expanded it. Domestically, the Kremlin tightened its grip. Independent media outlets were shuttered, social networks restricted, and dissent criminalized. A new law threatened up to 15 years in prison for calling the war a war instead of the state's euphemism, special operation. Thousands of Russians fled abroad, journalists, IT workers, and dissidents, creating a new wave of political exiles. Yet propaganda, nationalism, and repression sustained public compliance. Putin cast the war as a civilizational struggle, comparing it to Russia's fight against Nazi Germany. The Russian Orthodox Church, under Patriarch Kirill, provided religious justification, portraying the invasion as a defense of faith and morality against Western decadence. On the battlefield, Ukraine received unprecedented Western support. The United States and Europe supplied billions of dollars worth of weapons, from Javelin anti-tank missiles to HIMARS rocket systems. Western intelligence, training, and satellite support bolstered Ukraine's ability to resist. In September 2022, Ukraine launched a lightning counteroffensive in Kharkiv, liberating vast territories and forcing the Russians to retreat. The following month, Russia announced the annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, despite not fully controlling them. The annexations were condemned internationally, echoing the illegality of Crimea's seizure in 2014. In November, Ukraine retook Kherson City, dealing Russia another symbolic defeat. The cost of the war was immense. By the end of 2022, tens of thousands of soldiers had been killed on both sides, while civilian casualties mounted into the thousands. Millions of Ukrainians became refugees, fleeing westward into Europe, while millions more were internally displaced. Infrastructure across Ukraine lay in ruins as Russia targeted power stations, water supplies, and residential neighborhoods with missile barges and Iranian-supplied drones. The strategy was clear: to break Ukrainian morale by plunging the nation into darkness and cold during the winter. Yet Ukraine endured, relying on Western aid and its population's resolve. By 2023, the war had settled into a bloody stalemate. Russia mobilized hundreds of thousands of men in a partial draft, the first since World War II, though poorly trained recruits often suffered catastrophic losses. The Wagner Group, a private military company led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, played a central role in the fighting, particularly in the battle for Bakhmut, one of the war's longest and bloodiest engagements. But Wagner's growing influence created tensions within Russia's military hierarchy. These tensions erupted dramatically in June 2023 when Prigozhin launched an armed mutiny, marching his forces toward Moscow in what appeared to be an attempted coup. Within 24 hours, the rebellion was called off after negotiations brokered by Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, but the event exposed deep fractures within the Russian elite. 2 months later, Prigozhin died in a plane crash widely suspected to have been orchestrated by the Kremlin, a stark reminder of the risks of challenging Putin's rule. The war also accelerated Russia's transformation into a pariah state in the West while deepening ties with non-Western powers. Moscow expanded economic and military cooperation with China, though Beijing maintained a careful balance, supporting Russia rhetorically while avoiding full sanctions violations. India increased purchases of discounted Russian oil, while countries in Africa and the Middle East engaged with Moscow as part of broader multipolar strategies. Yet Russia's dependence on such relationships underscored its growing isolation from the world's most advanced economies. At home, repression intensified. Navalny, already imprisoned since 2021, faced additional charges that extended his sentence. Other opposition figures were jailed or forced abroad. Civil society was dismantled, with organizations labeled foreign agents or undesirable. Cultural life was reshaped by wartime censorship, as films, literature, and art deemed unpatriotic were suppressed. A new generation grew up under constant propaganda, taught that Russia was defending itself from Western aggression and historical injustice. In 2024, Putin secured yet another presidential term in elections criticized as neither free nor fair. The constitutional changes of 2020 allowed him to remain in power until 2036, cementing his rule as the longest since Stalin. The war in Ukraine remained unresolved, with shifting front lines, drone attacks on Russian territory, and continued Western support for Kyiv. Russia framed the conflict as existential, a fight for survival against NATO, while Ukraine framed it as a struggle for freedom and sovereignty. The economic consequences deepened. Sanctions reduced Russia's access to Western technology, particularly in semiconductors and advanced machinery, hampering industries from aviation to energy. Oil and gas revenues declined as Europe cut imports, though sales to Asia partly compensated. Inflation rose, and shortages of goods became common. Yet the Kremlin maintained a wartime economy, redirecting resources toward military production, subsidizing loyal elites, and keeping ordinary Russians reliant on state support. Internationally, the war altered the security architecture of Europe. NATO's enlargement to include Finland in 2023 doubled the alliance's border with Russia. Sweden's entry, expected soon after, would complete the transformation of Northern Europe. The United States and its allies increased military deployments to Eastern Europe, reversing decades of post-Cold War reductions. Far from reducing NATO's presence, Putin's actions ensured its long-term reinforcement. By 2025, the war showed no signs of resolution. Ukraine continued to push for the restoration of its 1991 borders, including Crimea, while Russia declared those territories non-negotiable. Peace talks, attempted intermittently, collapsed over irreconcilable demands. The conflict became a protracted war of attrition, draining resources and lives, but shaping the future of Eurasia. The trajectory of Russia under Putin was thus marked by paradox. It had reasserted itself as a global power capable of defying the West, yet it had also condemned itself to isolation, sanctions, and long-term demographic and economic decline. It had mobilized nationalism and consolidated domestic power, yet at the cost of suppressing freedoms and silencing dissent. Its invasion of Ukraine, intended to restore influence, instead galvanized the very forces, Ukrainian nationalism, NATO unity, Western resolve, that Moscow sought to suppress. From the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 to the war in Ukraine after 2022, Russia's history traced a path from collapse to revival, from fragile democracy to entrenched authoritarianism, from partnership with the West to open confrontation. The arc of its story revealed a nation still haunted by its imperial past, still struggling to define its place between East and West, and still willing to endure immense sacrifice in pursuit of great power status. From the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 to the grinding war in Ukraine by 2025, Russia's trajectory under Vladimir Putin unfolded as both a resurrection and a tragedy. What began as a country emerging from the ruins of an empire, searching for stability and identity, transformed into an assertive power that placed authoritarian consolidation at its core and sought to project influence beyond its borders. The history traced through these segments shows a continuity rooted not only in Putin's personal rule, but in the structural forces of Russian politics. The weight of empire, the fragility of institutions, and the constant interplay between weakness at home and assertion abroad. The early years were defined by economic chaos and the humiliation of a state dependent on Western loans, IMF prescriptions, and a rapidly fragmenting post-Soviet identity. Putin, rising from obscurity in the late 1990s, anchored his legitimacy in stability and order, offering Russians a return to predictability after the turbulence of the Yeltsin era. The Chechen Wars, brutal as they were, established him as a figure of uncompromising strength. The consolidation of media, the taming of oligarchs, and the restoration of state control were not sudden ruptures, but gradual maneuvers that recast Russia into a centralized, vertically controlled system. By the mid-2000s, high oil prices provided the resources for a revival, funding both domestic improvements and a reassertion of international status. But wealth alone could not conceal the fragility of political pluralism, nor the deep inequalities within society. The Kremlin tied prosperity to loyalty, co-opting elites while marginalizing dissent. Political opposition became more symbolic than effective, embodied by figures like Boris Nemtsov and later Alexei Navalny, whose persecution underscored the boundaries of dissent in Putin's Russia. The turning point lay in the 2010s. The 2008 war with Georgia was a signal of Russia's renewed assertiveness. But it was the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass that cemented a new phase. Russia as a revisionist power openly challenging the post-Cold War order. The annexation, executed swiftly and without major resistance, became a source of nationalist pride and reinforced Putin's image as the restorer of lost territories. Yet it also triggered sanctions, economic isolation, and a deep rupture with the West. From 2014 onward, Russia's domestic trajectory mirrored its external ambitions. Nationalism, orthodox identity, and narratives of Western encirclement became the ideological glue of the regime. Military modernization proceeded at a pace, even as corruption hollowed out parts of the system. Cyber operations, disinformation campaigns, and interventions abroad, from Syria to Africa, signaled a Russia experimenting with asymmetrical tools of influence. At home, repression tightened, with civil society dismantled and the press reduced to state or state-aligned voices. The 2022 invasion of Ukraine represented both a culmination and a gamble. It was a culmination of 2 decades of grievance, an attempt to reverse what Putin viewed as historic injustices of the 1990s, and a gamble that the West was too divided to resist. Instead, it produced the opposite: NATO expansion, Western unity, and Ukraine's hardening resolve. The failure to capture Kyiv, the attrition in Donbass, the Wagner rebellion, and the steady cost in blood and treasure exposed the contradictions of Putin's system. It could mobilize force, but it struggled to achieve decisive political outcomes. By 2025, Russia was locked in a war without end, sustaining itself through repression, propaganda, and a wartime economy. The regime endured, yet at a profound cost: demographic decline, isolation from the world's most advanced economies, and a future increasingly bound to China and the global South rather than Europe. What was meant to restore greatness risked cementing decline, as Russia bled resources and lost generations in pursuit of imperial dreams. The historical arc of Putin's Russia is thus one of restoration and erosion, of strength masking fragility, and of victories that carried within them the seeds of long-term setbacks. It revealed how deeply the legacies of empire, authoritarian governance, and geopolitical rivalry shaped Russia's path. Just as the Soviet collapse was not a clean break, but a continuation of older struggles, so too the Russia of 2025 bore the marks of centuries past. Its story is unfinished, yet what has unfolded demonstrates how the pursuit of power, unchecked and absolute, can restore a nation's pride even as it risks its future.